Good afternoon. I'm Rachel Silberstein. I'm the education reporter at the Albany Times-Union. It's Thursday, which means we're here talking about education. I'd like to remind everybody that you can post questions on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, and they will get to me. I'm here to have a conversation with you about some of the stories I'm writing and take some of your questions about education during the pandemic, especially now as school districts are trying to get in-person instruction back up and running. Specifically this week, the governor approved day camps, which was probably a huge relief to a lot of you out there whose kids are kind of going stir crazy from being home all day, or you're going stir crazy from caring for small children all day and trying to give them some sort of structure. And then that happened on Friday, and Friday there were a lot of parents of special ed students who go to summer school who were really strongly advocated for having special ed summer school opened as well. And their argument was, our kids need to be in the structure of school during the summer. And if you're just opening day camps and not opening summer school for kids with special needs or disabilities, it just creates this inequity. And these are kids, of course, who really, really need the structure of school. And if they have learning disabilities, these are kids that are really seeing significant learning losses because of the pandemic and school closures. They're children that are not always able to be reached through remote instruction. So if you guys have any questions or comments or experiences you want to share about, how you've been coping with school closures, having kids at home or kids with special needs who need that instruction and structure, please post them in the comments and I will do my best to, acknowledge them or answer any questions. So the other thing that happened this week, which was kind of a debacle, was the school board elections and school budget votes. Last week, we heard districts all over the capital region and really all over the state were struggling to get their ballots out in time through no fault of their own, but there just was sort of a backlog at the printer that they were all using. There's sort of a statewide vendor that they were using to print out the ballots. And it was, it was just creating a huge strain. They were trying to expedite, it's really expensive for school districts to send ballots overnight. And in the end, Cuomo, I think over the weekend said he would contemplate maybe postponing the June 9th deadline for receiving ballots. In the meantime, some school districts like North Colony were telling people, just bring them into the district, essentially come in, grab an absentee ballot and cast your vote, which is sort of like a workaround to get ballots in by June 9th. And by, I think it was Sunday or Monday, the governor did finally agree to delay the deadline for submitting ballots for school votes. So now it's the 11th. We still don't have an accurate count because basically if you were going to hand it in person, you had to turn it in by June 9th. But if you were mailing in your absentee ballot, then you have until June 16 to get it to the district. So we will have more information about how the school budget votes and school board elections went next week. So stay tuned. If you have any questions about how, if you didn't receive an absentee ballot, or if you have questions about how school budgets are going to work this year, please post them in the comments on Twitter, Facebook, and we will do our best to get you some answers. All right, let's see what else happened this week. So SUNY, the SUNY chancellor, that was a story that I broke this week. She is stepping down. We're not sure the exact reasons, but it's rather sudden. She's moving on for a very prestigious opportunity at Ohio State. Based on a follow-up story that I did speaking to one of Cuomo's top advisors, Larry Schwartz, it sounds like she had her differences with Governor Cuomo. Her predecessor, Nancy Zimpher, did a really good job at sort of raising the profile of SUNY and making it like a top priority for state legislators. And I think that he referenced her being an outsider from out of town and not working with government the way they would have liked. And it seemed like his sort of going on the record about this was an indicator that, he championed Jim Relatras, who now sort of heads SUNY Empire State, for the role and sort of is advocating for the SUNY Board of Trustees to forego the nationwide search and just, let Milatris take over that position. If you guys have any questions about, the search for a new SUNY head, obviously this is happening at a very critical time for New York and education and public education and public colleges. It comes at a time when the governor is really asserting a little bit more control over school systems. He's trying to, Jim Milatris heads up his panel to reopen the state, in particular, the education systems in the state, and reopen schools safely. And that's going to be a really complex issue. The schools are going to be dealing with incredible amount of learning loss and expenses associated with catching kids up, and PPE, keeping kids protected, social distancing. This one thing about the schools reopening, some summer schools reopening, is it's going to sort of be a model for what schools might look like in the fall. So the State Department of Health has put out some guidelines, but every school district that I spoke to, probably like a dozen, ranging from like small like rural schools to large urban schools, said that they don't have a plan yet. They want more guidance from the state education department and the governor's office before they can move forward with opening summer school for kids with disabilities. But the State Department of Health has put out some preliminary guidance, and they said, desks must be 6 feet apart. If teachers have to be closer than 6 feet to any student, they have to wear a face covering. There's some guidance about, sharing equipment. And so there's still not a lot of clarity about how kids can safely be returned to the classroom this summer. But there's definitely a very large and passionate group that's demanding it. Any news on local graduation ceremonies? Well, that's sort of a related topic. I think this is the week that Governor Cuomo announced that in-person ceremonies are okay to an extent, as long as people remain in their cars. I know there was some talk about, some school districts are already planning to do a drive-through graduation at like a drive-through movie theater. I know that, Albany schools already put out something out saying that they were trying to that they are already planning to do an in-person graduation. That was like, I know, a huge source of controversy for some of you parents out there. There was talk of just doing a virtual ceremony, and people were really sad. They were like, looking forward to having a real event, and they were hoping that they could find some sort of open air ceremony that would be safe and acceptable by the state's guidance, so that people can actually receive a diploma in person and have the full experience. If you are the parent of a 2020 graduate, we'd love to hear from you. I did an interview over the weekend. We had a story in our Sunday Times Union about some high school graduates who are, voiced disappointment that they weren't going to have your standard traditional, pomp and ceremony for their senior year, but they have decided instead to step up. They saw some of the difficulties that their neighbors are going through and decided to do their part to help give out masks to areas that are underserved, to help kids who have special needs and don't have any sort of structure right now. And another kid who's printing 3D masks for first line workers on his own personal 3D printing machine. So I think that it did sort of highlight how a lot of students, while, clearly they're disappointed, they're not thinking about themselves in this time, and they recognize that this is like a really pivotal time in history, and there's a lot of need out there, and there's a lot of people that could use their help. If you guys have any thoughts or comments on graduation, or want to share what your school district is doing, please, post them in the comments on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, and we can have a conversation about it. I do plan to write something this week, sort of updating, compile some of the plans that are emerging now in light of this new guidance from the governor's office. I think there are still questions about what's safe and what is feasible, but I do think that there's a strong desire for districts to have some sort of in-person event. And, I think they're probably going to be restricted and the audiences will be smaller, but hopefully, you know, seniors will get to celebrate this really important milestone. So what else? I'm working on some stories this week about any updates on school district layoffs. I have heard that there are layoffs underway. I think none of them have been formally announced yet because we haven't had school budgets finalized yet. That doesn't mean these districts that were proposed in the school budgets aren't going to go through even if the school budget fails, because the school budget that is approved by voters simply designates how much tax revenue the district can charge homeowners. It doesn't indicate what the school's expenses are or how sort of the revenue that they obtain from taxpayers in the state are divvied up among, you know, resources and staff and personnel and stuff like that. So if budgets are not approved and they have to go back to the drawing board, there still will be a, you know, there's a chance that they'll have to raise even less tax revenue from homeowners, and those cuts will still have to go through. So hopefully that budget, but I have heard that some layoffs are underway. I just haven't gone into detail or found out like how many or to what extent teachers have already been affected by these layoffs. So of course, you know, I would be remiss to not mention some of the protests that happened over the weekend. We saw Shen students organizing a protest for their school. It was somewhat controversial, you know, but everyone was socially distanced. They wore masks. And it was sort of a show of solidarity for one of our largest suburban school districts, for, you know, Black and brown people who have been treated unequally, particularly by police, following the end, you know, of course, this unrest, this national movement has sort of seen a resurgence in recent days after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. This sort of moment, this political moment in our country has also sparked some people trying to raise awareness of racism and, you know, microaggressions they experience on college campuses, in high schools, in middle schools. And this week we'll be publishing at least 2 stories about local educational institutions that are grappling with their own history of sort of, you know, turning a blind eye or being not fully holding people to account who made the school environments hostile to students of color. And that's something that we will explore this week. I don't want to ruin it. I don't want to be, you know, I don't want to spoil it, but we are publishing something today and tomorrow about 2 local institutions. So stay tuned. If you are a college student or a high school student and you feel that your school has not adequately addressed sort of its history of racial marginalization, or not adequately addressed complaints of racism or discrimination, please do get in touch with me. I'll post my email in the comments on the Facebook page, and you know, I'd love to hear from you. And you know, I think it's really a watershed moment for a lot of school districts. I think people are starting to recognize, you know, that the subtle, like, institutional racism that is throughout our educational system and how it feeds into like large scale like inequality across society. All right. Does anyone have any questions about school budget votes or the protests, or is there any sort of movement in your child's high school or college to sort of raise awareness about, you know, the unequal treatment of Black and brown people? Please let me know. I'd love to hear from you. If you have any thoughts on the next SUNY chief and who might take over, I'd love to hear from you about that. If you have any kids who are graduating, please get in touch. I love hearing from people on the ground. It helps me sort of provide color and nuance in my stories whenever there's like a voice of someone who's like personally impacted by the stories I'm writing. So that's why we do these. We want to hear from you. And if there are no other questions, I will sign off for today. But, you know, I'll be here next week.